Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We still have a few minutes till 3 o'clock, so we'll let that wait for a little bit. But we have to start as soon as possible because there's a lot of content to cover, so we'll get started soon. Hello, everybody. It's 3 o'clock. I think there's still quite a few more people making their way in, but I just wanted to welcome you all to our presentation of GRAS or NDIN, Regulatory Pathways for Novel Dietary Ingredients. My name is John L. Lagbon. I'm a business development executive at Burdock Group. And if you're not already familiar with what we do, we are an ingredient safety and regulatory firm that has expertise on, strictly regulatory as well as toxicology and scientific affairs. So, we've been in the industry for quite a bit, and so we would like to share our perspective on some of these novel pathways. So, before we get started, I know that some of you all have had the chance to attend CRN and ACI's dietary supplement event, and there were quite a few good presentations on NDINs there too. So if you already heard those, I apologize. You're going to get another healthy dose of NDINs. I hope that we don't exceed the acceptable daily intake. Thank you for the 3 toxicologists who attended who understood that joke. And I'll be here all week and probably the rest of the year because of travel restrictions. So with that, let's get started. Okay, so there is 4 key sections to this presentation, and I'm going to try to cover as much as I can and summarize as much as possible. We're going to try to get into the weeds of this, but not get too granular. So we're going to have kind of a way for us to talk in generalities as well as some key takeaways as well, so you guys can have the idea of what's working. So with that, we'll get started on the first section, which is setting the scene. So I guess in order to set the scene, we need to answer this fundamental question. How are they regulated? So as you probably remember from your civics course in high school, middle school, a bill goes through Congress and is passed. And when it is passed, it goes directly to the executive branch where the president signs off and the bill becomes law. Once it is law, it goes to the agencies, in this case for dietary supplements, FDA, and FDA creates regulations that capture the spirit and essence of the law. And they also create guidelines that clarify the regulation. So in order to do that, they have to send out a draft regulation for notice and comments. And then once they receive their comments and integrated them and addressed them, there's a final rule and regulation. So with that, it's the same process for regulation or for guidelines as well, so that there's good communication between manufacturers, consumers, as well as regulators. So before we keep moving forward, I'd like to make sure that one thing is clear. Laws and regulations are going to be referenced in today's talk. And so when I reference something, for instance, United States Code 21, that is a law. And if I say something like 21 CFR, that is a regulation, both of which are valid laws, and they both have the force of law behind them. So that's very important to note, and to help you guys understand that I'm not making this stuff up. If you want to read more about it, you're more than welcome to look this up as well. I'm quoting straight from there. So one more thing is that guidance is not law or regulation, but they merely explain the agency's position on a regulation. So one thing is certain is that you can't create rules or skirt the rulemaking process by issuing guidelines. That's very important to note. If there's a discrepancy with interpretation of rules or regulations, then things can go to the courts, and decisions oftentimes can help in terms of setting precedent. Okay, so with that very broad Civics 101 lesson, let's start looking at the agency that pertains most to dietary ingredients, FDA. So starting at the top, you have Commissioner, and then you have two distinct branches from that, and Office of Foods and Veterinary Medicine, and Office of Medicinal or Medical Products and Tobacco. For our purposes, we do more on the Office of Foods and Veterinary Medicine, but moving down another layer, you can see that there are three distinct areas that I want to highlight. So there's the Center of Veterinary Medicine, CVM, Center of Food Safety and Nutrition, CEPSAN, and Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. So for these three categories, on the two on the left, these are your food categories, as well on the right, it's the drug categories. So go down another layer, you'll start seeing more of the little differences here and there. But focusing in the middle, this is where we're really focused on today. That is the human food and food ingredients and dietary supplement wing of FDA. And it's further subdivided into two offices. There's the Office of Dietary Supplement Programs and Office of Food Additive Safety. For our purposes, these offices are the ones reviewing respective NDIN as well as the GRAS notification. And before we move on, I want to go to the very far left and show you guys that the Center of Veterinary Medicine is in charge of animal feed, and that dietary supplements do not pertain to animal feed. And I think if you were there for the last presentation I did, you may recall some of the little notes on that, but that's a very important thing to note, and that's something that you should realize. Okay, moving on. So as you took a look at or before we go into some of the terminology, I want to make something very clear. There's a very distinct difference between marketing terms and regulatory terms. So things like nutraceuticals, aquaceuticals, natural food, functional foods are marketing terms. There are no regulatory categories for these respective sections. So examples of regulatory terms would be drugs, food, food ingredients, GRAS, dietary supplements, food additives, etc. So if you're wondering in the presentation where nutraceuticals are, they're probably lumped under your dietary supplement. So further establishing a few concepts, you'll see, that food is quite broad. Food also encompasses dietary supplements. So with that, dietary supplements are food, but not all food are dietary supplements. And so you see also on the right hand that drugs are very distinct from that. Now, going a little bit into the brief description of these, food is articles used for food or drink for man or other animals. And dietary supplement is a product intended for ingestion that contains dietary ingredients intended to supplement the diet. And on the other hand, drugs, these are articles intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. So moving on, the biggest difference and probably the biggest distinguishing factor between whether or not you're a food, dietary supplement, or drug is what you say about your product. Now, food is very broad, and with that, they have a variety of claims that pertain to them, such as nutrient claims, which is your standard numerical or percentage claims that go on a label. Health claims, which characterize the relationship between a substance and its ability to reduce the risk of disease. A couple notes on that is that they must be authorized by FDA and require significant scientific agreement. And if you've ever been in a room full of scientists, that's probably very difficult for you to achieve in terms of a consensus there. So it's not easy to get a health claim. As well as a qualified health claim. That's authorized by FDA, but does not require significant scientific agreement. Also not easy to get. So those are the type of claims available to food exclusively. And when you move over slightly to the right under the subcategory dietary supplements, they have structure function claims. Now, these are things that, for example, calcium builds strong bones. And what they do is they describe the effect of the substance that the substance has on the structure or function of the body. Does not make a reference to disease state and does not require pre-market approval, but requires clinical evidence. Now, this is when things get hazy for many folks, is that they go in, they say they have a dietary supplement, and then they say things like, oh, it reduces the risk of stroke. Or a popular claim nowadays is, oh, this will help prevent coronavirus. So once you start going to that territory, you have gone past the point of no return, and that's a drug claim, and you are now officially treated as a drug. So the key takeaway from all of that is that the category to which your product may be reassigned by regulators, food, dietary supplement, or drug, may be determined by your claims or imputed claims. So I'd say that you should be very careful as regulatory experts or people within your companies to make sure that you keep a close eye on those marketing people. Alternatively, a better practice would be to educate them and provide solutions on what they can say rather than what they cannot. So yeah, you don't want to be that Debbie Downer, be solutions oriented as a regulatory person. Anyway, I'd like to pause here and state that before I keep going, I want to clarify that, you know, I have to, in the interest of time, I have to speak in generalities or general terms simply because of the interest of time. There's a lot to cover. So, you know, there are obviously going to be nuances and idiosyncrasies that I don't address, but, you know, we're speaking in broad terms. And if you have a very specific, interesting situation, you know where to reach us. You can definitely talk to us there. Moving on. So what are food ingredients? So we briefly defined them earlier, and this is the regulation. It's, pardon me, this is directly from the US Code, which is law. The term food means articles used for food or drink for man or other animals. Chewing gum and articles used for components of any such article. So breaking this down a little bit, which is what we're planning to do today, is, it's articles for food or drink for man and other animals, which denotes that the laws here also extend to animals, as well as all the other components of food. So that's ingredients, additives, things of that nature. So, although this law extends also to animals, or as I showed you earlier, animal feed is regulated by a different branch of FDA, and that means a different perspective and a different practice in real life. So ideally, they should be looking at this regulation and law that, it should be fundamentally similar, but they're not. So it's a different story. And if anyone's interested in learning that, you should definitely talk to Dr. Burdock. You probably need 2 or 3 hours to get through it. But in any case, moving on. So we've broken it down a little bit already. And as I mentioned, it is components of food as well, so ingredients. And so that also means things like sugar, aspartame, enzymes, algae-derived proteins and oils, as well as other additives used for producing, manufacturing, processing, and otherwise treating. So anything that is going to be consumed by humans. So other subcategories of food ingredients and the corresponding regulation that talks about them. So you have medical foods, infant formula, dietary supplements, which we're discussing. And I want to highlight even further, a little bit lower, under dietary supplements, which there are regulations, and then there are laws talking about dietary supplements. Unfortunately, the regulations are quite short in the CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, so I'm going to reference a lot from the US Code 21, Chapter 9, which contains the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, as well as the changes made by DSHEA. Excuse me. So with that, here are some food approval processes. Starting from the left, you have food additive petition, and on the right, you have generally recognized as safe. And on one hand, and right below generally recognized as safe, there are two uses for it. There's the scientific procedures as well as history of use. But in actuality, most of the time, it's usually going to be grasped by scientific procedures. So fundamentally, both of these pathways, FAP, food additive petition, and generally recognized as safe, GRAS, are similar in that you have to come up with a safety assessment. You have to characterize the agreement or the ingredient and do a consumption analysis to make sure that the EDI is well under the acceptable daily intake. The biggest difference, however, is that while one, FAP, goes directly to FDA and becomes a regulation, GRAS is not necessarily having to be notified to FDA. In fact, you don't have to notify them at all. As long as experts agree to safety and use, you are technically federally compliant. However, many people decide to notify their GRAS. And there are multiple points at which these pathways are compliant, and some options here for food approval processes. So for practical purposes, FAPs are very long and can take as long as 5 to 8 years with studies, and can cost as much as $800,000 with the studies to complete the testing requirements. Notified GRAS typically takes about 18 months still with the studies to receive no objection letter, and about $380,000 due to the testing requirements. So clearly, most people do GRAS simply because it's a better option for them. So when it comes to that, here's some criteria under which substances can be considered GRAS. First, experts qualified by scientific training and experience are evaluating the safety. And moving on to the second point, there is reasonable certainty in the minds of competent scientists. So competent not being the person that's on the floor or a foreman or anyone that's your second cousin. It's someone that's an expert on that respective area, respective ingredient and intended use. So you wouldn't want a poultry expert taking a look at a dietary supplement for humans. It doesn't make sense. It's not contextual. So moving on, one thing to note is that GRAS is not less than FAP, but the same quality of data is needed, but it's left more to the interpretation of qualified experts as to what type of data is needed. So a couple other important notes about GRAS versus FAP, that GRAS must be generally recognized as safe, meaning that the data must be available and published. And you need to have an expert panel review it. So you're really getting that general recognition by scientists. Okay, so that was a crash course in food additive and GRAS ingredient approval. Once again, apologies for the quick speaking, there's a lot to cover. So now, what are dietary supplements? So quoting from 21 U.S.C. Chapter 9, Section 321, the term dietary supplement means a product intended to supplement the diet that bears or contains one or more of the following dietary ingredients. So you have things like vitamins, minerals, herbs, or other botanicals, things like that. And anything that's not on this list oftentimes will not be considered a new dietary ingredient. More on that later. But, taking a look at this even further, the second part of this is that it's essentially saying that it must not represent or look like conventional food. So, and it must not be labeled as such either. It must be labeled as distinctly a dietary supplement. So it's a very distinct category, implicitly and explicitly. So once again, key takeaways here: dietary supplements must not represent conventional food or a complete meal and must be labeled clearly as a dietary supplement. Typical acceptable dietary ingredient forms are tablet, capsule, powder, soft gel form. So in other words, as I mentioned earlier, dietary supplement must implicitly, with appearance and ingestion method, and explicitly on the label, represent not conventional food and represent a dietary supplement instead. Very important. All right, keep going on the definition. So here's an interesting point here, and I guess I could summarize this up by looking at the highlighted portions of this. But what this is essentially stating, and you guys can read this once you guys get copies of the actual slides, but what is essentially stating is you can use food ingredients or dietary supplement as a drug, as a new drug. However, on the other hand, you cannot. This basically states that you cannot use a drug or candidate drug as a dietary supplement. So if there's been an IND opened and there's been some clinical trials for it as a drug, and it's publicly known, you can't use that as a dietary supplement. So you can go one way, but you can't go the other way. So, and the exception to both of these is unless the Secretary or FDA issues a regulation that basically says otherwise. All right, so I guess the next question is, at least in terms of the regulation that's pertinent to this, or laws that pertinent to this, is when is a dietary supplement adulterated? Now, what's interesting about the way that the laws are written here is that it seems like they are starting with what is not a dietary supplement, and then you'll see later on that what is a dietary supplement is oftentimes boiled down to the exceptions to what is not. And you'll see that as we move forward. So this is a lot of dense language, and I promise that we'll break it down, and I promise we'll get some diagrams too, but it's really hard to describe these things without writing them out. But let's break this down. A food shall be deemed to be adulterated if it is a dietary supplement or contains a dietary ingredient that A, presents a significant or unreasonable risk of illness or injury under conditions of use recommended or suggested in labeling, or if no conditions of use are suggested or recommended in the label. So this is a very straightforward part of this law, and that's basically saying that labeling is important as it governs exposure, or in other words, the amount consumed by consumers, which then dictates safety. So as a manufacturer or as a regulatory person within a company, make sure to include suggested serving sizes and that there is scientific evidence that supports your proposed serving intake. Okay, so moving on, part B. So now this is kind of an interesting portion of this section. Now these three clauses are basically stating that, the first one is if there is inadequate information to provide reasonable assurance, then it does not present a significant or unreasonable risk of illness or injury. And the second one being the Secretary declares to pose an imminent hazard to public health, and or if it contains a dietary ingredient that renders it adulterated. I didn't want to read all of it, but essentially these are not safety standards for dietary ingredients, but they define standards by which adulterated products may be seized. So it's basically saying, take a look at these things, make sure your label's good or else. So now that we've established what things are adulterated or when things are adulterated, now we can start taking a look at the exemptions to them or exceptions, or in other words, pathways to NDI compliance. So a dietary supplement which contains a new dietary ingredient shall be deemed adulterated under section 321F unless it meets one of the following requirements. So once again, we're going to break this down. And when you look at this language, it's really hard to tell that there are multiple paths outlined here, but there are. And this is what it looks like. I promised you to get back to pictures and diagrams. So in essence, this section basically allows us to decipher the exceptions, which are outlined here. And there are 4 of them. At the top, you'll see there is the old dietary ingredient consumed prior to October 15, 1994. Then there's GRAS, or existence in food, conventional food. And below that is new dietary ingredient notification. And below that is dietary ingredient petition. So we're going to talk about the first part of this. And it's basically saying that the dietary supplement, or, it's basically saying that it's adulterated unless, this is the exception, the dietary supplement contains only dietary ingredients which have been present in the food supply as an article used for food in a form in which the food has not been chemically altered. So, in other words, here's our key takeaway from that. Dietary ingredients that have been present in the food supply in a non-chemically altered state are not considered new dietary ingredients and are thus not subject to NDI approval. In other words, food ingredients, and by extension, some GRAS ingredients could be considered acceptable dietary ingredients. And that's the basis of this potential option. So we'll talk more about this in depth later. So moving on, this is number 2. It's the second pathway. It's available based on this section. A new dietary ingredient shall be deemed adulterated unless there is a history of use or other evidence of safety. So we're going to have to break this down because this essentially describes NDIN, or the new dietary ingredient notification process. So some of the key sections of this, the first one being that this is kind of the standard for safety, at least the mentality for it. So when you read this, it's when used under the conditions recommended in the labeling of the dietary supplement will reasonably expected to be safe. So before we even move on to the other parts, this is something interesting for us as food safety and regulatory consultants, because we have a lot of experience on the food safety side. So the interesting thing about this is that it says the term reasonably expected to be safe, whereas in food, in USC 21.9, section 348CA, food is reasonably certain to be safe versus reasonable expectation. Why this is a big deal is because, to most people reading this, you would take a look and say, oh, certainty. To be certain versus expect is you need more data. You need stronger data to be certain about something rather than to expect something. But the unfortunate reality of it is, it's not true, at least in practice with FDA, in terms of the expectation and the certainty of food versus dietary supplements. So while we believe that reasonable certainty mandates that this is, the gold standard certainty is, you have the data to be certain about something, you'll see later on that expectation doesn't necessarily line up in terms of the data requirements. FDA's interpretation, in other words, is a distinction without a difference. So we'll get to that in a little bit. So another thing that you need to do in order to get a new dietary ingredient compliant is to submit this or notify this to FDA 75 days before being introduced or delivered for introduction into interstate commerce. So what's interesting about this is that it doesn't say here that FDA has to approve it or even respond to it. All it says is that you just have to notify it. You just have to give it to FDA. So, at the end of those 75 days, you are technically good to go for sale. But the issue here is that if FDA comes back and says, hey, we're not filing this, in other words, we're not approving it, then you're technically supposed to stop sale. So it's a very interesting scenario here where, FDA is not technically approving something. It's not a pre-market approval process, but in practice it is. And actually, Congress was not too thrilled about giving FDA the authority to have pre-market approval in dietary supplements. And this is why the language is the way it is. However, in practice, it basically is a pre-market approval, because if FDA decides not to file something, you're not supposed to be selling it. You're technically selling an adulterated ingredient, which, as you know, doesn't count. You're not allowed to do that. So moving on. So the purpose of this is that stating that you are giving FDA the information or safety information upon which you're basing your use on. And what's interesting, and in comparison to food, is that the manufacturer or distributor has concluded that a dietary supplement containing dietary ingredient will be reasonably expected to be safe. Whereas if you remember, on the food ingredient side, it's experts qualified by scientific training. So it's another interesting standard for the dietary supplement system, is that the manufacturer is the one concluding safety, which in my opinion is a little bit more biased and a little more conflicts there than if a third-party expert was doing it. So these are some of the very interesting components of NDI and NDINs. All right, so here are some key takeaways from that. If not used in conventional food, new dietary ingredients must meet reasonable expectation of safety, and a dossier that contains safety information must be submitted to FDA at least 75 days prior to sale. And in other words, in order to sell an NDI, you must notify FDA via new dietary ingredient notification 75 days before you sell. I basically just mixed that up. I should have just cut out that part out. But in essence, you kind of get the gist. You have to submit a dossier to FDA 75 days before sale. All right, so here's a kind of a diagram of the process here. All right, so here's another option, a lesser known one, and it's a petition. So any person may file with the Secretary a petition proposing issuance of an order prescribing the conditions under which a new dietary ingredient, under its intended conditions of use, will reasonably be expected to be safe. So in practice, what this is actually, you're technically bypassing the Office of Dietary Supplement Programs, and you're appealing directly to the Secretary. And in terms of what that means for you as a dossier creator, or taking a look at regulatory paths, I'd say that the most similar pathway to this would be a food additive petition, however, with a different reviewer. And to my knowledge, I don't believe this path is actually exercised. So this is just an option that no one really uses. So probably because it's just impractical. So similar criteria, you're going to want the same types of data because you're trying to get a dietary ingredient there, so you're meeting that reasonable expectation of safety. So it would be similar, but just a different review process because you're giving it to you're appealing to someone else. No one really uses it. Excuse me, I gotta drink some water. Okay, so going back to the definition. So the purposes of this section, the term new dietary ingredient means a dietary ingredient that was not marketed in the United States before October 15, 1994. So basically what this means is that if it was marketed before 1994, then it is considered an old dietary ingredient, and you're not subject to new dietary ingredient notification standards. So you don't have to submit. But it's very vague and very difficult to kind of find evidence for that, and it's FDA stated that it's on a case-by-case basis. So, it's also kind of a very difficult thing to do. I read, however, in guidance that this also extends to international uses, so it doesn't necessarily just have to be in the U.S. And so there could theoretically be viable pathways for people, who have Chinese dietary supplements, or Indian, or basically TCMs, traditional Chinese medicines, or Ayurvedic herbs or things like that. You might be able to get away with this, but then again, it's very difficult to come up with the safety argument for that. Similar to, a GRAS has historical use, it's very difficult to find doses that were used and consumed by a population. So in practice, there are very few methods, and in reality, your viable methods are really GRAS or NDINs. So here are your takeaways for these 4 pathways. GRAS ingredients that are not chemically altered that have been used in conventional food are exempt from notification. Companies must ensure that labels specify safe levels of use. You can sell dietary ingredients 75 days after filing the NDIN with FDA, and you do not have to wait for the response, but I highly recommend you do. It's only 2 weeks from when they're supposed to respond to you, so unless you really have a pressing deadline, I think you can wait 2 weeks. NDINs require information, safety information or otherwise, that supports your intended use, and any ingredient prior to or sold prior to October 15, 1994 is considered an old dietary ingredient, but good luck getting that approval. So, as I mentioned, there are four pathways, but in reality, there are really only 2, and they're the GRAS and NDIN path. So let's start with NDIN. As we mentioned, this is kind of the rough breakdown of what this looks like. And essentially, once you get your safety package together, then you notify the FDA and you're allowed to go sell. Another brief breakdown of this is that, at least our recommendation is that you should do a pre-submission meeting first. And the reason being is that the safety standards that are in the guidance for NDINs are quite high, and I'll break it down for you, at the end of the presentation. But in many ways, it's much higher than what's standard or what typically works for things like GRAS. And so what you should do is schedule a pre-submission meeting with FDA and ODSP to make sure you understand their expectations for safety data. Once you have that, execute the tests, compile your safety data review, and then you notify it to FDA. And once again, you can sell 75 days after filing, and you do not have to wait for the response, but if you do, it's 90 days after filing. So because of and I highly recommend you wait the 2 weeks after that, because there is a 70% rejection rate at this point. And, a lot of it isn't just the high standards, but it's also the low quality of submissions, poor safety data, not meeting their safety criteria, or poor English. There are a lot of international supplement sellers that are trying to get NDINs. They just don't understand how to draft a dossier that's suitable for American or United States agencies. So that's kind of the rough outline of what this looks like. Let's look at GRAS. Let's look at generally recognized safe. So this is the diagram you guys saw earlier. GRAS for food use and still safe at levels used in food plus as a supplement. This is kind of how it breaks down to. You do your GRAS dossier, you put it in front of an expert panel, and I highly recommend you notify it. And then you need to make sure that it's used in conventional food supply. So a very simple explanation or a simple example of this is using probiotic in yogurt. So there's your food use, then because FDA has not specified the amount of time that it has to be in the food supply, you are good to go. You can sell this as a new dietary ingredient. There's another breakdown of that in terms of time. So you take a look at that, you do the scientific data review, you put it in front of experts, and then it's generally recognized as safe. By that point, it is technically federally compliant. However, as you need to have evidence of this being in the food supply, what better evidence than to have a notification to FDA? And that's something very important to note. So we highly recommend you do notify the FDA if you're using this as a pathway for new dietary ingredients. So the question everyone's been waiting for, which option works best for me? And I'm going to give you our favorite response is it depends. So breaking this down, we'll start with new dietary ingredient notification. So starting in a dossier format, your safety narrative needs to meet the reasonable expectation of safety and is structured in accordance to draft guidance on dietary supplements, the one that was issued in 2016. But roughly, these are going to be similar in format to GRAS. You start off with identity, characterizing that, making sure that you explain the science behind what it is and the manufacturing process, and then you assess the safety of it using historical uses as well. It's not just exclusively scientific methods for NDINs. So anything you can use, but we highly recommend you have an element of safety data there, as well as consumption analysis, making sure EDI is less than ADI. So with that, now a couple other important things to know about it is that there is no publication requirement for supporting data. So you don't have to publish that 90-day rat study. So if you have some sort of IP, very sensitive information, this is good news for NDIN notifiers because you don't have to publish that. Another thing is that you don't have to do a complete literature search. It's not a requirement for NDINs. That's in stark contrast to GRAS. And as I mentioned, their approval methods, companies can sell products 75 days after filing, and notification is mandatory. However, as I mentioned, while you can sell after filing, you probably should wait. Wait till you get a response because it's probably going to be we're not filing this, so no, it's not approved. So, this is a big surprise to many people. And I told you that this was, it doesn't make sense in terms of reasonable expectation versus reasonable certainty. Estimated cost with studies is about $850,000 if you have to do all the studies they recommend in the guidance, and it's stated there. So you'll see later on that it's really kind of it doesn't line up, essentially, expectation versus certainty. Anyway, we'll move on. So the timeline to FDA response is 90 days after filing date, as I mentioned. So this is the slide I was talking to you about in terms of, why this doesn't make sense in terms of reasonable expectation. Is that according to the draft guidance, the 2016 draft guidance, this is the suggested study battery. And, you have a 3-study genetic toxicity battery and 14-day range finding oral study and a 90-day subchronic oral study, which are actually very standard for GRAS assessments. And that actually makes up a lot of the safety data you'll find for GRAS. But what makes this difficult is that they also recommend multi-generational rodent reproductive study with a minimum of 2 generations and a teratology study. And while they say that, this is their stipulation is it's not needed, these 2 aren't needed if the product label is not for use by women of childbearing age, pregnant or lactating women or children 13 years or younger. So basically you can't use this for women if you don't do these tests, at least according to the guidance. So when you read the guidance, and I know it's non-binding, but it is a representation of the expectations by FDA. It's kind of disheartening because you're unless you do these tests, they're basically saying you shouldn't sell to women. So it's kind of a very difficult situation, and it's kind of putting people in the position of you basically have to do this if you want to meet their expectations. But once again, this is why we recommend scheduling a pre-submission meeting with FDA. See what they will accept, because not having to do those last 2 tests can save you about $300,000 to $400,000 easily. So it's very important that you communicate with the FDA, make sure they understand that you have a good plan. They may or may not accept it because the guidance is very clear, but this is kind of the unnecessarily high standards that you keep hearing about with NDINs, which are similar in practice to FAPs. And if you gather how many FAPs have been done in the past 20 years, you'll realize no one does them. And it's because of this. So, but there are instances where people should do an NDIN. So, and this is kind of chief when it comes to regulatory pathways, is that companies, it really comes down to what your clients want many times. So if you have a client who will only buy ingredients that are NDIN, you kind of have to do an NDI or NDIN. So that's kind of number 1. So another thing is clients don't want to use this for marketing purposes. That's another one. When an ingredient does not have a perceived technical effect in food, but may have an effect in the body that would be desired by consumer. For instance, a polyphenol in an extract does not have a nutritive value, but through antioxidant potential has been found to help support normal joint function. And when a company does not want to publish scientific data, another key reason to do an NDIN. And when characterizing the component of the ingredient, may have published studies suggesting it has an effect on mood. So that's a kind of a small reason and a very niche reason why people should do NDINs. And another one is when the notifier has no intention of utilizing the ingredient in a food type product, or that the ingredient can't be in a food type product. So that's something to consider too, is that if there's no legitimate use for this in food, or you can't find one, then you're really SOL. You have to go with an NDIN. So now let's talk about generally recognized as safe. As I mentioned, we're gonna highly recommend you notify it, and in fact, that's probably what we're gonna just stick to as the viable GRAS path. So it's a narrative of safety where there's a reasonable certainty within the minds of competent scientists. So as you see there, that one line, one phrase, reasonable certainty within minds of competent scientists, is in stark contrast to NDINs, where it's reasonable expectations from manufacturers, essentially. So it's very different there, and it kind of highlights in terms of the minute differences in language, the difference in how it should be perceived. So you're going to compose this GRAS dossier in adherence to FDA's final rule, published in 2016. Once again, you characterize the ingredients, assess the safety, and conduct consumption analysis. Unlike NDINs, you have to publish the safety data in peer-reviewed journal. There is a requirement to do a literature search as well as a food-specific consumption analysis as to how much is this going to be consumed. And unlike NDINs, you don't have to send this to the FDA. You only have to get an expert panel to review it, but we think you should send it to FDA. And estimated cost is, with studies, it's much less than what we anticipate for NDINs at $350,000. So timeline to FDA response is about 180 days after notification. And the reason why is because, well, not that, but the reason why it's much less is that these three tests are pretty much the standard for GRAS, and you don't see the two that were referenced earlier. So, if you have any need with testing, I highly recommend talking to product safety labs, specifically Jenna. And she's a great gal, and I think she can help you with this. So take a look at that. So moving forward, GRAS notification works best when companies want to use their ingredient as a food and dietary supplement. So with that, you have more uses. And so in the world of food, volume is everything. So why not have more volume? So moving on, when the substance of interest is not one of the dietary ingredients specified, so things like vitamins, minerals, herbs, or for instance, tyndallized probiotics, very, very niche, non-dietary supplement use. And companies that have self-affirmed GRAS ingredients that want to utilize the ingredient as a dietary ingredient, you should notify it. You really should. So approval and review process, another reason is that it's more established and consistent, and this allows for a much higher approval rate than NDINs. The study requirements are more consistent, less onerous, and thus less expensive than studies outlined in NDIN guidelines. And companies whose ingredients qualify for GRAS ingredients for use as a dietary ingredient. What I mean by this is if you qualify for GRAS pathway, you should do it. So in conclusion, if your ingredient qualifies for GRAS exemption by being used in food supply, in conventional food, does not have chemical alteration from its conventional food form, and there is no strategic reason to do an NDIN, your first option should always be to do a GRAS notification. Use the ingredient in food supply, then market it as a dietary ingredient. Only if your ingredient does not qualify for a GRAS exemption, or there is a specific reason you do not want it to meet a GRAS status standards, should you utilize the NDIN process, as there is a high risk of rejection, high expectation of safety, and a narrower use for your ingredient. GRAS is for food and dietary ingredients. So in conclusion, if you had to choose GRAS first, and if you have to, do an NDIN. Okay, we've made it. We made it with some time to spare, but before we get into questions, I want to highlight a very unique event that the Burdock Group is putting on next month. We're doing an event called Ask the Expert, and the way that this is going to work is that it's going to be a live broadcast, video and all, where Dr. Matulka and myself will be discussing human GRAS. And by that, we will be taking questions from the audience. So it's going to be 90% questions, 10% lecture. Unlike this, it's going to be reversed. And so we're going to really focus on drilling in on the things you guys are most particularly interested in. So keep an eye out for that. We're going to have registration opening up soon, and as always, it's free. So get on that as soon as possible before space fills up. And with that, do we have any questions? Okay. I knew we would get this one. How does the FDA define chemically altered? Pardon me, I need some water. Well, they define it in the draft guidance in 2016. So off the top of my head, one of the things that defines chemically altered is things that do not, one of the categories is do not break chemical bonds. They do not use different solvents other than the form that it was used in conventional food. And in essence, things that are not chemically altered or things that are acceptable are things like hydrolyzing things, putting in aqueous solutions, things that don't change the chemical qualities of the actual ingredient. Okay, so next question. Can you address self-GRAS versus notified GRAS and why you are highly recommending to notify and the risk of not notifying? Well, once again, in order to meet that exemption criteria of not having to submit a new dietary ingredient notification, you have to have history of use within the food supply, and you kind of want a paper trail that's solid. And I mean, it doesn't explicitly state that you should notify GRAS versus self-GRAS, but when it comes to it, you are basically coming up with a more legitimate process. You are coming up with a paper trail that states that you are using this in food. This has been accepted by FDA in food. And that's probably the biggest reason there is that you have the basis and someone in FDA has signed off and said this is safe. So that's why we recommend notifying. And obviously there might be some more reasons to that. But once again, when you are going through these exemptions, it's not clearly defined at times and it's not mandated to notify, but when you're trying to claim that you are a safe ingredient, best bet is to notify FDA and the food side. So that's why we would recommend it. I think it puts you at a far lower risk and I think more justification for using your ingredient as an NDI. Okay, moving down. Generally speaking, what kind of safety data do you need either for NDIN or GRAS for a new strain of microorganism if the species is already widely used in food, e.g. lactobacillus? Would NDIN be preferred option in this scenario? Actually, no. Well, first of all, if you're having a probiotic, and we'll just call it a probiotic, you should do it in GRAS simply because while there are some exceptions to this, and some people might disagree with me, probiotic and a microorganism is not listed under those acceptable dietary ingredients, the vitamin, mineral, powder, etc. I'm telling you that some people have different opinions on that, but it's not explicitly stated there. So you should do a GRAS, and ultimately, if you can, you should. But in terms of specific tests and studies, still do the 3 we recommended for GRAS. I think it's on the GRAS slide. But when you're dealing specifically with something that's already used widely in food, especially if it's just a different strain, you have a couple other things you should probably do. And obviously we can talk about this on a more specific level, but you want to make sure that you analyze the genetic sequence of your respective strain as compared to something that's already been shown to be safe. And if there is potential for things to, there's a potential pathogenic strain that's closely related to it, you might want to do what is called a pathogenicity test. So, everything is context dependent, but, you have to still do those 3 oral toxicity tests and genotox tests, but there are some special considerations when it comes to probiotics. And I still think you should use GRAS, but hey, if you want to do an NDIN, we're not going to stop you. This is not recommended. How often does a self-GRAS product rejected by FDA after reporting, and what would be the implications and consequences? Oh boy, I don't know the figure off the top of my head, But I'll tell you that self-grass, well, if we're talking about notified grass, when you do the notification portion of it, I still don't have the figure off the top of my head, but I'll tell you that if you do things right, by the book, by the well-established industry standards, you shouldn't have a problem. And it would really just be coming down to understanding the specific instances, like for the lactobacillus question earlier, the probiotic question earlier, you might want to do some more probiotic tests for that. But as long as you do things quote unquote by the book in terms of GRAS, you should get approval or no questions from FDA. It's a lot more consistent, and the standards there are not moving around. So I'd say if you're doing things right for notification, the chances of rejection are pretty low. But that's if you do things right and you kind of have a good argument for things. Is there a regulatory difference between food or food ingredient? Is an unaltered product, an edible seed or nut, necessarily considered an ingredient and therefore in need of GRAS? That is an interesting question. So let's see if I can answer this. But let's start off with the first question. Is there a regulatory difference between food or food ingredient? In practice, no, there is not. They're all food. A food ingredient is food based on the definition that we provided earlier in the CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, and they're therefore subject to the same safety requirements. But when we start getting into an unaltered product, an edible seed or nut, I think one thing is that I don't believe it would, especially if you're thinking of things like pecans. But once you start getting extractions for pecans, for example, the shell of a pecan, then you start getting into the territory where you need to show that it's safe. And in some ways, you can basically claim that there is a history of consumption for an edible seed. I mean, pecans have been consumed for a long time, at least, I don't know, but a long time. But I don't think you'd need a GRAS or something like that. But when you start getting into extracts or things that are, a little more novel, and you start getting into that, I need to have a GRAS to show safety because this has not been consumed in the standard human diet. Hope that answers your question. All right. Is it okay to use an ingredient that manufacturers claim self-affirmed GRAS but not publish? Whole foods are exempt. Okay, let's see if we understand that. So is it okay to use an ingredient that manufacturers claim is self-affirmed GRAS but not published? So I take it that you are you have a value-added product and you're buying from a manufacturer, and this manufacturer is claiming that their ingredients are self-affirmed, but they have not published. So if they haven't published, they need to publish, but they don't necessarily have to notify. And that is something that's a distinction to note. But if they have not published, and that's what you were asking, make sure they publish their safety data. And so there's a difference between publication and notification. So if someone notifies to FDA, that's a completely different thing. But when it comes to this, you don't necessarily have to notify the FDA. So this is acceptable. It's not the best strategy for a person with a self-affirmed GRAS dietary ingredient. So hope that answers your question. And I think another very important question that people are really interested in is, a little bit more about expert panels. So the question I have in front of me is, do you recommend that an expert panel opinion always be used for GRAS? It's not a recommendation, it's a requirement. You have to have an expert panel review your GRAS dossier, and you should probably adhere to FDA's guidelines as much as possible. I mean, some of the criteria there is a little much, but you want to have an expert panel that is, I guess, I want to say a neutral third party that has expertise in that respective area. So for instance, as I go back to the poultry example, there's poultry GRAS and a human GRAS. You have an expert panel for both, but you want to make sure that the people on the expert panel reviewing the poultry grass are poultry experts. You don't want someone that's a dietary supplement expert on the poultry panel. It doesn't make sense. And it's about credibility. So you have to do your due diligence to make sure you have the right people. So you probably shouldn't choose someone in your company. You probably should choose an outside person, someone who has experience with this. So to answer that question of, do you recommend that an expert panel opinion always be used for grass? It's not a recommendation, it's a requirement, so you should do it. And I guess, yes, we do recommend it. So make sure you get that grass reviewed by an expert panel. Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. All right. Moving on, for dietary ingredient that has successfully gone through the self-GRAS process, is there a defined amount of time that the ingredients need to be in the food supply, or in other words, marketed in food product? Alternatively, does the self-GRAS ingredient even need to be marketed in food prior to its use in dietary supplement? So it's actually undefined, the amount of time in the food supply. So it's one of those things that, it's left to your interpretation. But once again, when it comes to these things that are not as clear, you want to have credibility. So one thing that is actually outlined in the guidance, 2016 NDIN guidance, is that, having it in the food supply, one of the things that does not count is, putting it in a power bar or in a drink and having it in your office's food supply. That doesn't count. Once again, you want a paper trail when you're doing this. So you probably should find a manufacturer that's interested in this, or if you have manufacturing capabilities or have clients or vendors, put it in that after you've done self-GRAS notification. And that's probably your best bet to get that paper trail requirement of food supply. But, in terms of time, there's no specified time. But your best bet, if you want to have credibility, which is what you should have for this, do it for 6 months, sell it, make sure that it's in stores or people are actually buying it and is actually being consumed by a population. So, and you mentioned alternatively, does the self-GRAS ingredient even need to be marketed in food prior to its use in dietary supplement? The answer is absolutely. Okay. Has FDA ever taken a published position on acceptance or rejection of grandfather ingredients list that were submitted in comment in the 1990s to FDA in response to Shea's proposed rule? Wow, you're going way back. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that. But once again, and I think this is a good way to wrap things up. So there's a lot of good questions out there, and you guys really string me out, and they're really good stuff. But we don't have the answers to everything off the top of our heads, and if we can't answer it now, we sure as heck can make time to try to address them later. So, with that, we're running out of time and we're about to close. If you have more questions and things that I can't answer, for instance, this last question that would require a little bit more work or a little more digging, we can certainly answer those things. And, one thing that we could do is set time up, shoot us an email, let us know the question, and we'll do our best to get back to you. And if we're interested in the next event, it will be, like I said, 90% Q&A, 10% lecture. Okay, I'm getting one more question. Very important one, apparently. So you're mentioning self-GRAS notification. What do you mean by that? So I guess we can address it in the next webinar, but one of the things by self-GRAS notification is that, as I mentioned, the GRAS process does not need to be notified to FDA. It's optional. When you say self-GRAS, typically the proper term is self-affirmed GRAS, meaning that you don't send it to FDA. But when you do, you're notifying FDA. So it's no longer self-affirmed GRAS notification. It's just a GRAS notification that's been notified. So self-affirmed is the proper term for quote unquote self-GRAS that you don't notify to FDA. GRAS notification is when you do notify it to FDA. And those types of things, we will address in the next event that we have. And I will go back to that slide here. You can ask the expert regarding the human GRAS topic that we have coming up next month. So there's a lot of good questions. Obviously, we'll try to answer them all, but I highly recommend you attend this event. I promise you, we will answer your questions. All right, thank you very much for being patient with me. It was very dense. It's been a roller coaster, I guess, in terms of information. Once again, slides are available upon request, so shoot me an email, shoot us an email, and we'll do our best to either answer questions or give you the slides. And the webinar recording should be available too. So have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for your time, guys. Take care.